Hello, in this presentation we're going to take a look at the home page and specifically the vendor section of the home page within QuickBooks Pro 2018. We will be continuing with the Get Great Guitars problem. If you are following along with us, that's great. If not, that's okay. We will be talking about the home page and looking through the icons on the home page, paying special attention to the vendor section in this presentation. If you have access to the backup file, you can restore the backup file by going to the File and Open Restore. We took a look at the process for doing so in a prior presentation. We're also going to have the Open Windows list over here open, and to open that, go to the Windows tab, or the View tab, I should say, and then go to Open Window List. And that will keep these open windows open. The only thing we currently have open is the home page. The home page open. In order to get to the home page, if the system did not open to the home page as it normally does, then we're going to go to the company up top and home page. It's useful that QuickBooks does open to the home page because the home page is the driving page. It gives us really most of the areas that we're going to need to input data, and it gives us a nice visual in terms of what data is there, the systems that will be in place by cycle, by vendor cycle, by customer cycle, and by employee cycle. So by going through these cycles, by going through this visual, we can enter data in a fairly easy way using forms. Those forms then is what QuickBooks uses to generate the financial statements. So QuickBooks is trying to give us a guide for us to put the information in as easily as possible using these forms. What we're going to do is take a look at these forms, take a look at the flow within each of these sections, within the vendor section, the customer section, and the employee section, starting with the vendor section here. And we'll go over the flow in general, talk about what it does, what these forms do. And then as we go forward and look at some other areas within QuickBooks, we'll always go back to this home page. We're always going to take a look at these driving icons that have these driving forms that are going to help us to generate the financial statements. Look at the effect on the financial statements later on. We're going to start off here with the vendor section. We here have started a company that has both service type businesses and merchandise, meaning we sell inventory and we sell services. If we set up a business that's set up that only has services, we may not have all the icons here. We may not have the purchase orders or the receive inventory icons here. We will typically always have the enter bills and pay bills icon. That's going to be the main thing that will be there all the time within the vendors section. So as you set up your company within QuickBooks, and we'll take a look at that setup process and the preferences for your company, depending on those preferences, what type of company we are, whether we are a merchandiser, whether we're a service company, then these icons will differ. We look at the standard icons for the vendors section, what happens is we're going to enter bills and then we're going to pay bills. And that's going to be the typical flow from the vendors section, meaning if we have the typical bills at the end of the time period, we're going to pay the utility bill, we're going to pay the rent bill and whatnot. We're going to enter those into the enter bill icon here. And as we do that, QuickBooks will generate the journal entry as we input this data. When we go into the enter bills icon, it really looks a lot like a check. So it looks like a check, but it's a bill. And the fact that it's a bill just means that QuickBooks is going to increase what they call the payable account. And that's going to be what we owe to. It's going to be accounts payable. It's going to track who we owe by vendor. We're going to enter the vendor here. We'll have the date. We'll have the address. And then we'll have to pick some other account, usually an expense type account, possibly an asset type account. Later on, we'll pick an inventory type account in the inventory items. And as we do that, QuickBooks, by being a bill, will increase the fact that we owe somebody money, and they will increase the other thing that happened if it was an expense, like utilities expense. It will produce that and generate that on the journal entries for us without us needing to know debits and credits or how to build an income statement or how to build a balance sheet. So these are the driving data input forms. Going to close this back out with the X icon up top. And then of course we are going to pay bills. That's the typical vendor's scenario. We pay the bills. If we click on this, we'll have a list of all the bills that we will then want to pay. And we can track the bills in this format, and we can just tick off which bills we want to pay. And then we can either write a check for those bills, meaning we'll have external checks that we'll put into the printer, and they will be pre-printed checks that will then, the amounts will then be printed on them, but the check numbers will be pre-printed on them. Or we can just enter the data into QuickBooks and have the checks generated in some other fashion, perhaps by hand, but use QuickBooks to enter the data into the system so that QuickBooks can make those financial statements we need, the balance sheet and the income statement. I'm going to close this back out. That's going to be the major format of the vendor section. Now, in order to set up the vendor section, there's going to be some other driving factors we need. We're going to need a chart of accounts. We're going to need to set up some vendors. We'll talk about how to do that in a bit as we go. However, we could do some of those things as we actually create the bills. We could create vendors as we generate bills. We could create accounts as we generate bills. But when we look at those lists, when we look at the chart of accounts, when we look at the vendor list, we will go back and forth to this home tab and these driving documents. We then have a purchase order, receiving documents, and enter bills. These are going to be specific to if we sell merchandise. So if we sell merchandise, we may pre-order the merchandise with a purchase order, and therefore if we're going to get some goods, in our case guitars, we're going to buy guitars, we would then request the guitars with a purchase order. We select the purchase order. It's going to look like this, and we're going to select the item here. That's going to be an inventory item. If we go back one, we can see a purchase order where we have an inventory item, the description of the item, the quantity that we're going to have, the rate. This is just a request to our vendor, in this case Epiphone, for these items. There's no actual journal entry related to this. This is a request for those. I'm going to close that back out. Once we get the inventory, then we can go to this icon and I'm going to close that back out. I'm going to try to hit the drop down. And we could say receive inventory with a bill or receive it without a bill. And so typically we're going to invoice, we're going to get the inventory with a bill typically, and we're going to have to enter that information, increasing the inventory we have and entering the bill. And then eventually we of course will pay the bill. And that's going to be the process for us ordering inventory and then paying the inventory. If we order inventory, then the people we order from, in our case we're going to be ordering guitars and then reselling guitars, are going to be our major vendors that we're going to have to track. And we will track who we owe through the reports that will be generated as we enter bills into the system. We also have this item up here which is manage sales tax, and that's going to manage the sales tax we have when we make sales for items that have sales tax or a value added tax, and that's going to be different for each state that we have. What are going to be the different taxes that we're going to have when we make the sales, and QuickBooks provides this item to manage. The reason it's up here in the vendor section and not in the customer section, because typically we charge sales tax to customers when we create invoices to our customers or create sales receipts, not when we create a bill. However, when we pay the people, the government agency that we owe for the sales tax or the value added tax, then we are going to have a vendor. So we're going to be paying that organization will be a vendor to us. This will help us organize that and track who we owe and pay that automatically. We'll get down to how are we going to calculate the sales tax, or where does the sales tax come from when we get down to the creating the invoice and when we talk about items.